everybody, and a warm welcome to my YouTube channel. My name is Lauren, and today I'm going to be explaining how education system in England works, particularly contrasting it to the USA, because I've got a lot of American friends and a lot of American family, and they are very confused about how the education system works in England, particularly because it's so different. Genuinely, if someone was going to ask me, what do you think is the biggest difference between the USA and the UK, I would say it is the education system. So without further ado, let's get started. So the education system in England is split up into 5 key stages, which hopefully, if all goes well, should be displayed on this chart over here. You can see from the chart that in England we start school a year earlier than Americans do, but key stages 1 and 2 together make up the same years that Americans would call elementary school. Key stage 3 makes up the same years that Americans would call middle school, and key stages 4 and 5 together make up the same years that Americans would call high school. However, it gets a little bit more complicated because in most parts of England, you go to a primary school for key stages 1 and 2 together. Sometimes there is a different system. Sometimes we do have middle school depending on the exact area, but the key stages always stay the same regardless of which part of England you are in. Then most people, unless you go to a middle school, move on to secondary school, also known as senior school. Some places call it high school, for the beginning of key stage 3, and you stay there for both key stages 3 and 4. Now it gets a little bit more complicated at key stage 5, as I will explain later in the video, but most people leave school after that point and go off to a separate school for key stage 5 because many schools don't continue that high. However, some schools, such as the one I went to, do actually continue to key stage 5. However, it's very common to switch schools at that point, even if your school does stay all the way up to key stage 5. So key stages 1 and 2 really aren't that different from each other, so I think it's worth covering them in the same section as each other. Now, they're not actually that different from American elementary school, really, so I'm not going to spend too much time on them, and I'll instead talk about the important exams that happen during this time. They're not that important, but they're a little more important than, let's say, some random spelling test that your teacher gives you. Now, at the end of year 1, not the end of key stage 1, but the end of year 1, which is kindergarten for you Americans, students do a test in phonics. Now, this is done in a kind of casual way to the point where the child might not necessarily even realise they're being examined. The teacher brings them some pictures of cute little monsters with funny little names and asks the student to read the name of the monster. Now, the idea behind this is it's testing that the children can actually read real unfamiliar words rather than just having memorized what certain common words look like on the page. If the student fails this test, they do have to take it at the end of year 2. However, in general, your child is not going to fail this test. If they don't know how to read, they will fail. If they know how to read, your child has absolutely nothing to worry about. Now, at the end of key stage 2, so at the end of year 6, or what Americans would call 5th grade, students do tests called the SATs. Now, this is spelt the same way as the American SATs, but it's not the same thing. Please don't get confused. Now, these tests just test some basic things such as maths and spelling and grammar, and really it will just be what they've been learning in school anyway. Teachers try to tell the students that these are really, really important because the schools are judged on their results, but it doesn't really affect the students. So again, if you have children in key stage 2, don't worry too much about the SATs. In fact, I underperformed on mine a little bit because I was ill on the day and I'm at Oxford University now, so it clearly didn't harm me any. Now, key stage 3 is where the differences between the English versus American education systems really start to show. So at the beginning of key stage 3, in most but not all parts of England, you move to a different school, and now you take every single subject that your school offers all at once. Now, that doesn't mean you take them every day, because that would be, there's only 24 hours in a day. But at a lot of schools, you'll have a 2-week timetable or perhaps a 1-week timetable with different lessons every day. So for instance, I was taking English, maths, science, history, geography, French, Spanish, art, religious studies, dance, drama, music, PSHE, food technology, graphic design, PE, obviously, which is sports, and probably some other things that I've forgotten about off the top of my head. So you take a lot of subjects. Now, that's not to say that you take every subject at the same level, because essentially, different, more important subjects you'll have more times a week. So at my school, for instance, we had maths 4 times a week, whereas we might have only had art once a week because art isn't considered as important. So you take every subject, but not the same number of hours per week, if that makes sense. Now, if you thought Key Stage 3 was different from the American education system, just wait until you hear Key Stage 4. You might want to watch this part of the video multiple times because it is very, very different. So after having taken a very wide range of subjects in Key Stage 3, Key Stage 4 is where you start to drop the subjects that you no longer like. There are some subjects that you have to continue to do legally. For instance, you have to do maths, you have to do English, you have to do at least one of the sciences, biology, chemistry, or physics, or most schools actually teach them together just as science. So you have to do science. You also have to continue doing education in religious studies, but you don't have to receive a qualification in religious studies. And therefore, some schools will choose to be a little bit lackluster in terms of how they teach religious studies. For instance, they might say, 1 lesson every 2 weeks, that's good enough, it doesn't really matter. Similarly, you also have to do sports or PE, but again, that doesn't count towards your qualification, and therefore some students, not everybody, but some students at some schools might see PE as like a break from the real education. Now, other than this, you can choose a range of other subjects to take, or perhaps more accurately to drop because you had taken them before this point. Some schools will have specific requirements, but my school had no requirements other than religious studies being a mandatory qualification to take rather than just the lessons. So I personally chose to take all 3 sciences rather than just one science. I chose to take further maths, which is basically like double the amount of maths. I also chose to take French and Spanish and art. Now, my school is perhaps a bit unusual in having no requirements because a lot of schools might make you take, for instance, either geography or history. Some schools might say you have to take one language, but you're not allowed to take more than one. Honestly, it depends on the school. But the only legal requirements are the ones that I already mentioned. Now, one thing that's very different in Key Stage 4 is that the schools no longer design their own curriculum and the schools no longer make their own tests. Instead, you do the curriculum that is set by one of a few different companies called exam boards. Now, I suppose a useful analogy here, if you are American that's watching, would be it's a little bit like AP exams, in the sense that if you're taking an AP class in the USA, your school doesn't decide what's on the AP exam. The college board that sets AP exams gets to decide what's on the AP exam, and your teacher will teach exactly what's on the exam. And it's very similar in the UK, except that in Key Stage 4, you take those exams after the end of 2 years, so you take them at the very end of Key Stage 4, rather than at the end of the year like you would with AP exams. Also, they're not considered college-level classes in the UK. They're considered just what you do in Key Stage 4. So in Key Stage 4, these exams are known as GCSEs. And you will often hear people saying phrases like, oh, he's doing his GCSEs, which is kind of slang for he's in Key Stage 4. But the actual qualifications that you get at the end are called GCSEs in the same way that the qualifications you might get in America are called AP exams. Now, these are much more similar in terms of the structure to AP exams than they are to things like the SAT and the ACT, for instance, because obviously the SAT and the ACT are things that Americans do outside of school. I mean, they might take it physically in the school, but it's not that their entire curriculum is designed around it. Whereas here, our entire curriculum in Key Stage 4 is designed around around GCSEs, to the point where your school probably won't teach you anything that's not on the GCSEs, because the GCSEs are designed for you to teach to the test. Now, I did mention exam boards, and those are basically a very small number of companies. Those are Edexcel, AQA, OCR, and sometimes WJEC. Particularly, they're common in Wales, but you can use their exams in England too. Those are companies that the government has specifically approved to design those curriculums and therefore those exams. However, the government has put a lot of guidance into what those companies are allowed to do. Therefore, you will find that pretty much no matter which exam board you're using, everyone will be learning very similar things. Now, there is a massive advantage to this, because it means that no matter what school you're at, you're going to be learning pretty much the same stuff, and therefore you can buy, for instance, a book called a revision guide, which is basically a book that says everything you need to know. And that is incredibly useful if you have to miss some school because you're ill, for instance. You know, if you're feeling unwell and you miss school, you've got a book that basically says everything your teacher would have taught you that day anyway. So that is very useful. And it also means that private tutors, for instance, will know exactly what that child needs to learn because the curriculum is the same at pretty much every school. Now, the thing is, much like AP exams in the US, the homework that you do throughout the year does not contribute towards your final exam grade in GCSEs. There are some subjects that are exception. For instance, in art, your homework absolutely does count because it's a little bit difficult to assess your painting ability in a formal exam. But for the vast majority of subjects, it is entirely based on the tests that you do at the end of those 2 years. Now, that's not to say that students don't do their homework, because they generally do, because they don't want detention, and also because the teacher will intentionally set homework that they think will help the students to practice the things that they will need in order to score well in their final exams. Now, because of the fact that all of your subjects have final exams at the end of those 2 years, those are spaced around about a month, and you get what's called study leave. Now, study leave basically means that while it's exam season, during that month, generally towards the end of May, the beginning of June, you don't have to go into school apart from the days that you have exams. So it might be common to sort of have a day off of school where you're studying for your next subject test, and then go into school in the morning to do the test, then come home in the afternoon and start studying for the next day's test, then maybe have another day off, etc. Now, once you finish your last exam, generally towards the middle of June, roughly, obviously it depends what subjects you're taking, but after you finish your last exam, the summer holidays starts immediately. Now, this is very different because in the rest of the year groups you might be in, so for instance, key stages 1 through 3, the summer holidays generally starts in mid-July. So your summer holidays might start up to a year early. Not up to a year early, that would be ludicrous. Up to a month early at the end of Key Stage 4. Now, the thing is, that doesn't mean you get your results. In fact, you have to wait until National Results Day, which is in mid-August. And the reason for that is because obviously it takes a lot of time to mark these exams. They're not marked by your teacher, they are marked by members of staff at the exam board, and there is a very rigorous process involved with marking them, so it takes quite a while. But when you arrive at school on the morning of National Results Day, which is in the middle of the summer holidays, but you go into school just to receive your results on that day, you'll receive them in a small envelope, and it will tell you what grade you got in each subject. If you think that one of your grades is really much lower than you would expect, you can request for it to be remarked, which basically means that another person comes in and checks that they haven't completely made a mistake when marking your exam. Now, some people might get their grade increased a small amount by that, but most people's grade stays the same after remarking because it is quite a rigorous process. Now, the exams themselves, I think I forgot to mention this earlier, the exams themselves are very much designed to avoid bias. So I personally think that it's a better system than having your teacher set their own exams, because you don't want any unconscious bias in the making of the exam. Now, once you've got your GCSE results, you can move on to Key Stage 5. Now, here's where it gets a little bit confusing. the school leaving age in England is 16, but the education leaving age in England is 18. And I think this trips up a lot of Americans because they'll ask someone, oh, what's the school leaving age? And some people will tell them 16 and other people will tell them 18 because it's not a straight answer. The school leaving age is 16 and the education leaving age is 18. And what that basically means is after you get your GCSE results, every single school becomes selective by default, which basically means that there is no guarantee that any school will accept you to continue their studies. But it also means that if you don't want to stay in school and you'd rather choose a vocational route, you can choose to leave school and do something like, for instance, get an apprenticeship at a hair salon. Now, the one caveat is that if you did not pass your English GCSE or your Maths GCSE, you do have to keep retaking this GCSE, but you can do that while doing an apprenticeship or something else. But other than that, you can drop your academic subjects altogether and go straight into an apprenticeship in whatever line of work you want. However, if you do stay on the academic route into Key Stage 5, you will most likely go to a sixth form or a college. Now, this is not to be confused with American colleges, which are what we call universities, but instead a college is a school that is designed just to be Key Stage 5, so it doesn't contain any of the lower key stages at all. It's just what you guys would call your junior and senior year of high school, or what we would call Key Stage 5. Now, if you instead choose to stay on at a school that does go all the way up, which not every school does, then you'll be in what's called a sixth form, which is basically the name for the Key Stage 5 portion of what is otherwise a normal school. Some people will refer to colleges as sixth form colleges as well. Now, before I even get into how the exams work and things, it's probably worth noting that because of the fact that you choose your own school at this point, your parents don't choose your school at this point, you choose your own school at this point, it means that you're given a lot more responsibility because the school wants you to be there, the school wants you to choose that school. And therefore, it's very common for schools to have more relaxed rules. So, for instance, it'll be common to have a sixth form common room, which is a common room that only the sixth formers, aka Key Stage 5 students, can go to. None of the younger years are allowed in there. It's also very common to no longer have a school uniform at this point because school uniforms are extremely common in the UK. Nearly every school has one, but a lot of schools will have a uniform up until the end of Key Stage 4 and then let you either wear your own clothes or make you wear business dress, like business casual, in Key Stage 5. Another common rule, not every school does it, but they let you go home at the times that you don't have lessons, because at Key Stage 5, you no longer have lessons taking up the whole day. Instead, you have a smaller number of lessons and then the rest of the time to do private study, which is basically kind of, doing homework, for instance, or independent work. And so some schools will let you go home during this time. Other schools won't. My school didn't let us, but we did have a specific room that we could do this work in, generally unsupervised. Now, in terms of how the actual exams work, it's very similar to GCSEs, if you are staying in the academic route, of course, that is. What you'll do is A-levels, except instead of doing, roughly 10 subjects like you might have done at GCSEs, now you narrow it down to only your 3 favourites, and there are no longer any requirements. So you can drop English, you can drop maths, you don't have to do sports anymore, you can choose literally whatever your 3 favourite subjects are. So, for instance, I chose to do maths and physics and chemistry, but I also did a 4th one, which is further maths, which again, as it is similar to GCSE, in A-level further maths, it's basically just twice as much maths, because I love maths. And very similarly to GCSEs, you have study leave at the end of when you're doing your A-levels, so that you can focus on studying for those exams in particular. And similarly to the same way that someone might say, oh, that person's doing their GCSEs when they're in Key Stage 4, you might say that person's doing their A-levels if they have chosen that academic route in Key Stage 5. Now, I think perhaps one important thing to note is that there are other academic routes instead of A-levels. So some people might choose to do, for instance, the International Baccalaureate, which is an international qualification. They do it in other countries too. Some people might instead choose to do BTECs, which is somewhere between academic and vocational in the sense that they are broadly academic and you can do them in subjects such as science, but they're also slightly more practical and slightly less exam-based. but some universities won't accept them. For instance, Oxford will not accept BTECs, but many other universities will. So that is an alternative option, and there are several others that I won't even bother listing, but the most common academic option is A-levels, and that is the one that people will be most familiar with. Now, another thing that I think is important for me to make a section about would be the differences in the grading system, because wow, is that different between the USA and England? In fact, not only is it different between the USA and England, but it's also different between A-levels in England versus GCSEs in England. And it's even different between GCSEs in England now versus GCSEs in England back in 2016. Things change. And so first I'll explain the A-level grades. Now it starts at A star, which is the top grade considered above an A, then it goes down to A, B, C, D, E, and then if you fail, it's called a U here rather than an F because it stands for ungraded. Now the thing is, I think it's very common here to get lower letter grades than you might expect in the USA, simply because, the letters mean something different here. So for instance, many universities you can get into with 2 Bs and a C, that is considered a, good, decent, respectable set of grades, as an example. In fact, many universities you can get in with quite a lot lower than that. If you want to get into places like Oxford and Cambridge, you might require A's and A stars, but I don't think there's hardly any universities that require you to get 3 A stars. So don't necessarily judge British kids based on American grades, because they are not the same. Now, in terms of GCSEs, we used to have letter grades, but now we instead have number grades, and the numbers are done from 1 to 9, where 9 is considered like very exceptional, like you've done a fantastic job. You would not expect anyone to get all 9s. That would be like genuinely incredible. 1 is, you did very, very badly. And 4 is considered a standard pass and 5 a good pass. So what that means is that 4 is a pass, but 5 means you passed rather than just scraping a pass. And then, 6, 7, and 8, in between there. That being said, you will hear a lot of British people referring to the number grades with equivalent letters just because, our parents won't be used to the number grades because our parents did it back with the letters. And in fact, when I did my GCSEs back in 2017, I had a mixture of letters and numbers because they hadn't fully introduced the numbers yet. And I think that can be something very confusing to Americans because I've seen some interactions before where someone will say that they got, a grade 5, and they'll say, it's equivalent to a high C. And Americans will be like, that's not a good grade. Whereas the person with the grade 5 is very happy to have gotten a grade 5 because, again, the letter grades here are generally, lower letters are generally considered not that bad over here. Especially because over here, there's no such thing as remedial classes. You're taking the same GCSE exam regardless of whether you are the next Einstein or whether you are someone that would be in special education. You're still taking the same exam. So there's a very wide range that gets tested, and therefore something like a C is considered, reasonably respectable. Another thing to keep in mind is the percentages that you need in order to get the different grades. In the UK, it's very common to have a high level of application of the knowledge tested in the exams. So not just can you memorize these facts, but can you use these facts in an unfamiliar context? And therefore, it is very common to be able to get the top grades with relatively lower percentages than you would expect in the USA. So for instance, 70% will often get you a top grade in the UK. You can pass with often around 50%, for instance. Obviously, it depends on the subject, it depends on the year, it depends whether you're talking about GCSEs versus A-levels. But don't be alarmed if you're an American parent and you see your British students' education, their percentages. It's nothing to panic about. You can get good grades with low percentages here. Honestly, there is a lot that I've missed out simply because the two education systems are so different. But if you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment. I will happily make a second video answering all of the questions that I get if I get a lot. Also, feel free to like and subscribe. Who knows, I might make more videos at some point in the future. And yeah, I hope that this clears things up. Bye!